Okay, thank you all for joining us today and welcome. We're going to give just a moment for everybody to get in before we get started. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, thank you everyone that's joined us today. Our webinar today is Redefining Effective Communication in Our New Normal. My name is Amy Thompson, and I'm the CEO of Creative Allies, a marketing firm in Raleigh, North Carolina. And so just a few logistics before we get started. We are going to cover 3 topics today with our panelists, and then we'll have a few minutes at the end to answer any questions that you might have. You should see a chat area on your screen, and you can actually input your questions here at any time, and then at the end we'll come back and try to answer as many of those as we have time for. So we're going to go ahead and get started, and today I am joined by a phenomenal group of leaders to share their insight on effective communication. I'd like to have each of our panelists take a few minutes to introduce themselves to you, but also share some initial insights on the importance of effective communication. And Stephanie, I'm going to start with you.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Stephanie Cottle. I am a publicist, and I am also the CEO of Black Girl Group, and we are a freelance staffing agency that connects African-American women freelance to creatives to companies seeking to outsource more diverse talent. And just a small piece of advice right now as it relates to communicating to the press would be to be conscious of the current news cycle we're in. We're living in such a crazy time with coronavirus, racial injustices, and I keep hearing the aliens are next. And so I just share that to say that journalists have a lot going on in their own lives, as well as in the workplace. So whenever you're reaching out to them to get coverage, make sure you're treating them like the humans they are and having as much grace as possible.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Jackie, can you go next and introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Amy. Hello, everyone. I'm Jackie Ferguson. I'm the head of content and programming for the diversity movement. I'm a certified diversity executive, an ongoing contributor and member of the National Diversity Council, and the host of the Diversity Beyond the Checkbox podcast. So in my work, strong diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives lead to more profitable business and a stronger company culture. And at the heart of that stronger culture is inclusive language. And that means consciously working to find ways to name, honor, and value experiences and identities. And when you do that, you create a culture that responds better. They have greater morale, and they work harder for your organization, which again leads back to increasing the bottom line.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Yeah. And Anne-Marie, if you can go next and introduce yourself.
Absolutely. So I am Anne-Marie Tapke. I am the CMO of Holderness Family Productions with Penn and Kim Holderness. I've worked in social media marketing since about 2008. I've led a lot of award-winning campaigns that I'm very proud of, and now I get to do really fun internet videos, as you probably see, with the family, as well as expanding their family brand. One piece of advice I would give is just the core principle of what social media marketing was really made for, and that's talking with people and not at people. It's really important to be listening just as much as you talk. And so that would be one key piece of advice I would have to start this off.
Perfect. Thank you. And I hope that listening is something we talk about a little bit more, because that is so key. Sharon, last but not least, if you can please introduce yourself. Uh-oh, let's see. Sharon, are you there? Sharon was having a little technical difficulty, so we may have to come back to her. Sharon, just jump in if you get back online, and we'll keep going here. So I appreciate everybody's introduction and also just sharing some initial insights into effective communication.
Sharon, Delaney, McCloud, and I'm.
Looks like she's kind of coming in and out.
Part.
All right, I think we got that. Okay, so one of the things I want to mention, there are so many different types of communications and different audiences that we communicate with. And so we're going to, I think I mentioned, touch on 3 buckets We're going to talk about communicating to your employees, to your customers, and to the press. And that's why we have kind of a variety of folks on today who can really touch on each of those. And so we want to start talking about communication to your employees during what, you may have different names for this. We'll just say unique year of 2020 and what kind of things make for effective communication. Jackie, I want to start with you on this one.
Sure.
Remote working is something that is unfamiliar to a lot of people, especially, we were talking earlier about school for kids, but also for the parents who are working. And so can you share some ways, either positive or negative, of how diversity, equity, and inclusion is impacted because of the remote nature of working in our new normal?
Absolutely, Amy. So as far as the positive, we kind of shed the facade of the work persona that we have, right? So when we go to work, we're dressed nice, our hair is done. The first 2 weeks of, working from home, I saw a lot of cameras off, not being ready to be on camera and have people see you. But now what we're seeing are people's homes and their kids running back and forth through, Zoom meetings, and pets wanting attention, and spouses running behind the camera like we can't see them, and we always can, right? You're seeing, band t-shirts and messy hair, and it reminds us about the entirety that makes up people and, what their life includes. So, Sue isn't just an accountant, but she's a parent, and she's a AC/DC fan, and, she's got a dog, and that's really great in creating connection, because connection breeds empathy and understanding, and that's what diversity, equity, inclusion is all about. On the negative side, you have to be deliberate about your interactions, I think, with people outside of your day-to-day work groups. So, you're not having the hellos on the way to the restrooms or the stop and chats in the break room. There are no group lunch breaks anymore. So it's very easy to get siloed, and that's not great for inclusion. And that's not great for connectivity. What I would say to kind of combat that is, call up your workmates that you used to interact with a lot. Do a virtual lunch or even a group, happy hour at the end of the day, just so you're able to make those connections and touch points with people. I think that's very important. So there are some positives, but also some negatives that you just have to be aware of and learn how to mitigate.
Okay. Thank you for that. And I want to go, Stephanie, to you next and just expand on that, if you will, but also touch on the role that tone and emotion play as you are communicating with people in kind of these different areas that Jackie mentioned, but also just in working remotely and away from people.
Yeah, I think now tone is even more important than it's ever been, right? So whenever you send an email, if you feel like you're going to have a tough conversation, maybe you shouldn't send an email. Maybe you should pick up your phone. And I think right now, we really have to pause even before we send those emails, because we're all dealing with so many different layers of our lives. Like some of us have kids at home. Some of us have parents that we're caregiving. Some of us have, spouses who are working beside us as we work from home. And so we have to be very conscious that maybe it's not personal. Maybe, that person had a very challenging day, but if you don't pick up the phone, you don't really know that. You don't always get the full picture when you're sending out an email. And so, when you send out an email. So I think it's really important that you're intentional in how you communicate, because now is a prime opportunity for a lot of confusion to happen, especially amongst coworkers and clients, and even your boss. And so the more you can give those that you're communicating with a holistic picture of your life, I think the better it positions to make sure there is no miscommunication happening between the two of you.
Great. And Sharon, we're going to try one more time. I think part of this new normal is also being flexible, because you never predict what is going to happen in a live situation. And so I think that Sharon is back with us. And the part that we missed, Sharon, if you could take a moment to just introduce yourself and then talk about any insight you'd like to share on effective communication. And then we'll get back to the session.
Sure. My apologies. We can plan, which is what crisis communications planning is. And then there always will be the unexpected, which is exactly what just happened. I was online all morning doing virtual calls all morning. And then all of a sudden, 15 minutes before this, my internet went out. So anyhow, I have moved to a different part of the house that seems to have a stronger bit of a signal. So anyhow, to give you a little bit of background, Sharon Delaney McCloud, partner and vice president of professional development at Walk West, and also a communications consultant for the diversity movement. My career in this is my second career. My first career consisted of 20 years as a broadcast television journalist. So I lived for crisis news almost every day. I went to work every day not knowing what I would be covering. And so I come at it helping people refine their messages and prepare for crisis messaging because I used to cover it. So I'm turning the tables and helping people prepare to how to do proper storytelling so you're not tone deaf and that you're actually creating the right narrative in the moment.
Good. And I think one thing I'll add to that is if we just think about, because I think these online meetings are such a good way to describe our lives. You know, Sharon looks great. She comes back in and she just flows right with it. And we have to learn from that because things are going to happen that we don't plan for, like she said. And how do you react to it? Everybody can forgive, something wrong happening, but how do you recover and how do you react? And so I actually think it was, even though not scripted, it was a nice way to talk about your background.
All planned, except I can see my ring light now. If I had my ring light and better lighting, then it would have looked totally planned.
So I want to talk next about customers and communicating with your customers, which could be a little bit different than your employees. And so something that we hear a lot is know your audience, right? And we're all familiar with using social media to communicate with our customers. But I want to jump to Anne-Marie as the social media experts. And I want you to talk about social listening, which may not be a familiar concept to everyone, but it is a great way as we think about knowing your audience. So could you talk about social listening and how businesses can use that to really understand their customers better?
Absolutely. And to an earlier point, I think that Stephanie made with knowing the news cycle, that also is really important, especially to your audience, knowing what kind of news that they're consuming, where their head might be at, what might be stressing them out. That also can help you, to even Sharon's point of not being tone deaf. When you talk about social listening, there's a sophisticated way of doing it, and then there's also a very simple way of doing it. So to me, social media is very exciting because it's a real-time focus group all the time. You can garner so much information from social media, and you don't have to have a fancy listening tool to do it. There are ones, however, if you do have a budget, that you can get where you can listen for your brand mentions, you can listen for topics and keywords that might be similar to your brand or your business. And you can also measure sentiment. You can look at how people are feeling about those words. I mean, do they feel joyful? Do they feel angry? There's some very, very sophisticated tools out there that you can even teach emotions to. So I don't know if the aliens are next or like our computers totally becoming self-aware, but anyway, that is there. But if you are just looking to do this even casually, I believe it's so important. So not only if you're going to be in social media, you have to be a consumer of social media, in my opinion, as well. So looking at even something like TweetDeck and Twitter, scanning different types of websites that you know that your audience is on, that's a way for you to start to pull out different themes and make connections to your brand or your business. So you can be top of mind and you can be real time, and you also can speak in a way that if you already know there's going to be some hurdles around this topic, you've kind of like already done your work there. So I would encourage people, TweetDeck is free. That's something that you can search all day long. There's other free tools. If you just do a quick Google search, Google is my best friend. I Google things all the time. If I don't know how to do something, I just always Google it and seem to find the answer. So that's one way you can start to listen and understand what your audience is saying and how they're feeling.
Good. And just a quick add-on to that, what about those of us, people in the audience who don't have a lot of time, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes social media and just communication in general can seem overwhelming. How do you, or what advice do you give to help people narrow down or prioritize so they're not doing a lot of nothing, but they're, focusing a little bit more?
Yeah, it's a complete rabbit hole, right? I mean, heaven forbid anyone on this is on TikTok because you've lost 2 hours already. So that's a very, very good question. I would try to batch some of the activities that you're doing in social. Now, I have to say this with a caveat because things are changing at a rapid pace all the time. So I don't subscribe to the fact of like set it and forget it, doing all your content like a month in advance. But you could schedule out, a few days and keep tabs on things and know if you need to pause something, you pause it and it's no big. And then also just dedicate time. I mean, if you want to be great at something, you're going to make time to do it, right? And so you don't have to spend hours and hours, but I think even casually, if every morning for 20 minutes with your coffee, you did this and you started to get into a habit of it and you just set your timer, don't do it for more than 15, 20 minutes. I think it would become easier and easier over time.
Got it. Thank you for that. Jackie, I want to move to you along those same lines of knowing your audience. What are some things that people usually miss, and how is having that foundational understanding of who your audience is really improve your communication to that?
Yeah. Amy, to me, it's important to realize that society is changing. So in my work, that's what I study quite a bit. The world is becoming more and more diverse. And then we have Generation Z coming into the workplace and the marketplace. And this generation is more diverse than any generation before. Their family is more diverse. Their friends are more diverse. And they're also cause-based shoppers. So they are interested in aligning with brands whose values align with their values, which is different from generations before. In the 60s, your audience, whether you were a manager or a marketer, was, white, Christian, middle class. But here we are in this very diverse world. And now many personas that you're leading, working with, selling to, decision makers, for example, are more diverse, and the people that you're marketing to are different. Their needs, habits, goals, all differ from one another. And, you need to understand how to be able to effectively communicate with them. And that goes back to the diversity and inclusion of your team. And that's why you need diversity of your team and why inclusion is so important, because then you're able to test message through these diverse groups and seek authentic and honest feedback, which is very important in your messaging and how you communicate.
Good. Thank you for that. And before we move on, is there any other feedback that anyone would like to share on that kind of knowing your audience piece? And if not, we'll move on to our favorite topic, which is about press. And I'm going to rely heavily on our PR experts here, Sharon and Stephanie, but Jackie and Anne-Marie, please jump in, if you have anything to add. But as a business, whether you run a business or whether you're an employee in a business, you may have or will likely have both positive and negative interactions with the press. So it's very critical to effectively communicate with members of the media. Stephanie talked earlier about, we forget this a lot, everyone is human, not just us, right? So the people in the media, they have lives, they have kids. They're struggling with online learning for their kids just the same way everybody else is. And so making sure you recognize that before you communicate to them is really important. But Stephanie, I wanted to start with, a little bit of what you touched on. If you have positive information to share, maybe you have a product coming out or some news story, how do you get that out into the press when everybody's focused on COVID or everybody's focused on the election that's coming up, focused on racial injustice? What if you just have a book or something that's coming out? How do you get that message into all this chaos?
Yeah, I think now more than ever, I think we have to be very intentional again about which outlets we're reaching out to. So if you have a new book out, if it's not really on the topics that are trending at hand, then perhaps you need to pitch it to, a podcast, or perhaps you pitch it to a local publication that covers authors. I think it's really important to also know, again, that because these journalists are humans, they have a job to do. And their job is to cover the stories that are most important to their viewers and their audiences. And unfortunately, right now, it's those things, it's the elections. It is, the economic situation that we're facing in our country. It is unemployment. It is the coronavirus. It's schools reopening. And while, it may be exciting to you that you have a new book coming out, realistically, you have to ask yourself, what's in it for the journalist, right? So I had a teacher in college who said that we all work for WIIFM, and that's what's in it for me. And I think you have to recognize that if your book does not offer anything to the journalist that you're pitching, then perhaps they're not going to be the one who's going to cover your story. It's not personal, but right now I think news is very purposeful, and we have to be okay with that. And I want to share this piece of advice: is if you have a new product, maybe if you can wait, maybe now you shouldn't release it. Not to say you won't ever be able to, but just know timing is everything, and even the right thing done at the wrong time could still be the wrong thing. So you want to make sure that you're conscious of that, and you ask yourself, is it okay for me to, push this or release this now? And if it can wait, be okay with waiting.
Yeah, no, that's excellent advice. And Sharon, on the negative side of things, what if you have news that's not so positive to share, and maybe the press and the journalists are coming to you? What if your business has had to lay off people? What if someone from your team has made an outrageous statement? What are some tips in dealing with the media when it's not positive?
Well, the first thing is never lie, because you will be found out. People think that they can change or add different details to lessen the impact of a negative event happening at their company, or to an employee, or to an executive within the company. But I'm here to tell you, you will be found out at some point. It may not be at that moment, but here's the thing. Everyone is now a citizen journalist because of our phones. Anyone at any time can use their smartphone and start live streaming to any number of platforms, and in fact, even to CNN. And so if you think that you can somehow not tell the truth about a story, you are fooling yourself. So here is 4 steps that you need to remember, especially when there is something negative. Never say no comment. That's step number 1. The second you say no comment, what are people thinking? That you're trying to hide something. Yeah. If you say no comment, you're setting yourself up for all the talking heads to fill in the gaps. Take control of the story yourself by having a crafted message that is truthful and also disseminates the information in an appropriate way and with the sense of urgency that's necessary. So number 1, never say no comment. Number 2, you have to, what we like to say is develop a buy time statement. So let's say there is a crisis situation where your CEO has been let go because of some inappropriate behavior. Since you're not going to lie about it, and you're not going to say no comment, you have to acknowledge the situation. And then the next thing you do is you show concern. And then third, you want to give status. So for example, acknowledging the situation would be, yes, we have had an unfortunate incident. There are accusations against our CEO, which are now actively being investigated internally and externally. So that's acknowledging. The second piece is showing concern. So our number 1 priority is for the safety of our employees. And if any of our employees feel as if they have been harmed by any action of any member of our team, we want to know about it. So you're showing concern. And then third, the status update. As we said, this is an ongoing investigation. We will continue to update you as soon as we have the information that we can share. So and that works for if there were an accident at a manufacturing plant, or God forbid, some kind of awful thing like a shooting at a workplace. People with cell phones are in your building tweeting the station or sending pictures. So oftentimes people are finding out breaking news on their telephones or on their cell phones and on computers before the news even gets it. So that's why you need to acknowledge the situation that it's happening, and then show concern, and then give the status update.
Let me ask this, Sharon. What about, that's focused a lot externally. What about internally? How would that change when you have that same situation to happen and you now have to also communicate status or information to your employees. How does that advice change? Is it the same?
It actually does not change. Think about employees who hear nothing from the top when something bad is going down. Not a good situation. So the no comment or the silence is a terrible. That's not a way to do internal communications. You need to be upfront, honest, and show concern.
Got it. And then
Amy.
Oh, yes, go ahead.
I'm sorry. And I just want to say too, Sharon, she just really raised some really great points. And I think it's also the reason why you should not wait until a crisis to plan for a crisis. Because then you're running around like with your head cut off, trying to figure out what you're supposed to say. But if you have some kind of template that's already in place for your company, both internally and externally, when those situations arrive, you'll know how to make that smooth transition into crisis management.
Yeah. No,
and you also have to have the people and the roles already set forth as to who is going to be the point of contact. Is your CEO or is your HR person or your operations person going to be the spokesperson for the company? If that person's not available, who's next in line? You create a bench of people who will be media trained and well aware of any crisis plan that you've put into place. Like Stephanie said, a template of what that is. And frankly, we believe in actually doing mock drills of this sort of exercise at least twice a year.
And that's a good point. That was actually going to be another question is, who on your team should be responsible, especially when you're dealing with businesses that, maybe only 3 people, 5 people, right? How do you select the right person to deliver that message? And so I think that coming back to the planning and the preparation piece of it is really important. So I appreciate that. What I want to do next actually is, just talk a little bit in more general, but just have each of you talk about some tips that you can share with the audience. At the beginning of this, when you introduce yourselves, you kind of gave one high level insight, but what are some tips that you can share? Since effective communication is definitely not something that, we can dig all the way into the details in a short session like this, but it is something that whether you're the CEO of the company or whether you're an employee, a manager, not manager, it doesn't matter. Everyone needs to understand how to communicate effectively. So I'd like to ask each of you to just talk about some tips that you can share. Where should people go for training, or where should they go to learn more? What kind of tips can you offer? And Jackie, I'd like to start with you on this one.
Sure. Thanks, Amy. Well, my tip is to use inclusive language. Again, I started with that, but I'll say that again. That is at the heart of a good, strong company culture. It leads to so many things like productivity. It drives creativity and innovation throughout your organization. There's better collaboration, problem solving, when people feel included. And at the heart of that is inclusive language, which means that you don't always know everyone that's in the room. So there are some rules that you can use to make sure that your language is inclusive. And I'll share the first one of those rules, and that's put people first. So when you talk about people, lead with the individual, not with their descriptors. So when you're saying things like my Black doctor or my gay friend or my disabled coworker, that's wrong. You always start with the person and then the descriptor. But another point to that is to always remember to only mention the descriptor when it's relevant to the conversation. So if you have a Black doctor, why is that descriptor important? It's generally not, right? But what might be appropriate is if you're having a conversation and you say something like, I went to lunch with a coworker that has a disability and realized that there's not enough ADA compliant measures in the restaurant. That's when it's appropriate. But you want to make sure, that you're putting people first in your language. And again, there are 6 rules. I have a white paper actually coming out on this topic that talks about all of the rules, and it's called Say This, Not That. And it gives you some tips on, things that are very often said, why that might be wrong and what to say instead. But Amy, if you don't mind, I'll run through quickly the other rules, so I'll take a second to do that.
Yeah.
So again, we talked about putting people first. The second one is to use universal phrases. So when we use idioms or industry jargon, that can exclude people. And then sometimes people aren't comfortable saying that they don't understand. You don't want to exclude people from your language. The next one is recognize the impact of mental health language. So when we say things frivolously like, oh, she's OCD, when really what we mean is that she's very detail oriented, and careful and selective about things. You want to be careful that you're not offending people that have real mental health diagnoses. The next one is to use gender neutral language. So as a Northeasterner, I grew up saying guys. That's not inclusive. People often start conversations with ladies and gentlemen. That's also not inclusive because you're not acknowledging everyone in the room, and there might be some non-binary people in the room. So it's better to say things like everyone, or even you all. We're in the South, right? That's actually a very inclusive term. The next rule is to be thoughtful about your imagery. So often you'll find, especially in writing, people use words like black and dark to mean something negative. So you want to look for other words because that's offensive. And then the final thing, and one that's so important, is just to ask if you're not sure. So inclusive language is nuanced and it changes over time. So take time to find out how people self-identify. For example, using pronouns is one tip there. You can ask, what are your pronouns? That's an important thing to think about when you're trying to be inclusive, and making sure that people, again, feel honored, feel valued, and feel like they can be their complete selves.
Good. Thank you for that. And I'll point out one thing, the guys, you guys, is something that, I use all the time. And I remember, hearing from you about that. And it's really interesting, even sending out emails about this, I have to delete and say everyone, because you don't know if you're offending someone. You might not hear about it. And so you do have to train yourself in just the different things that we've learned, we have to unlearn and get better. That is so important, whether it's just an email or social media communication, that is so important. So I appreciate that. Sure. Anne-Marie, can I go to you next? And you just, kind of share with us one or two tips that you'd like to share related to social media or anything really related to communication.
Absolutely. So one goes alongside what Sharon was talking about earlier. I just wanted to reiterate that those 3 steps also apply to social media. When you have a customer complaint, and there's different types of complainers, by the way, not everyone is really trying to help you. Some people are chronic about it. Some people genuinely want to help, and then some people just want to be heard. So it's important to follow very similar steps. You want to acknowledge the situation. You want to provide empathy. And then the only difference is I would also provide some sort of next step, whether you're trying to give them an email to maybe get some more assistance, or you're trying to do something to show there's forward movement on the issue. And I subscribe to the idea that you hug your haters. You respond to everyone. If someone's being vulgar, inappropriate, and you need to take them off your channels, that's a different situation. But that's one tip that I would share. I love some of the other tips that Jackie just went through, and actually Stephanie as well, and talking about just being human and putting people first. That is so important in social media. And it's so important too, just to use people speak, use human speak, real speak. And that also can be helpful in a crisis situation. So there's always an example that sticks out in my head, and it's when United Airlines released a press statement saying they reaccommodated a passenger, and in reality, what they did, what someone caught on their cell phone, was that they dragged him physically off a plane. That is not how you do things. And so if you are part of a larger organization, it's really important to work hand in hand with PR, not to say that you are driving the train, but it'd be important to say, you know what, I don't think this statement is empathetic enough. I don't think that people online are going to respond positively to this. Even just raising a flag can be so important in a situation like that.
Thank you. Stephanie, what about you?
Yeah, so I'll go back to my original point, talking about how journalists are also human as well. So just as a little sidebar, in another life, I was a social media investigator, which was a real job. Where I worked for a company where literally my job was to go on social media and figure out, based off of people's posts, if they were committing insurance fraud or not. And that skill actually helped me a lot as a publicist, because now when I'm researching my journalist online, I'm now able to somewhat be what I like to joke as a professional stalker. And so I may see a tweet where perhaps you said, hey, I lost my mom today and I had to come to work. Or perhaps you posted, not having such a great day, send prayers my way. Whatever the case is, I know exactly where that person is mentally and emotionally before I even reach out to them. And sometimes I use that to help guide my decision on whether or not I want to reach out to them on that particular day, because I realize, like, hey, they just tweeted, 2 hours ago that they're overwhelmed. So the last thing I want to do is send them a pitch, which could also overwhelm them 10 times more. I also use it as a way to, again, see what they're already working on. Oftentimes, I've found that journalists, specifically for TV and newspapers, they tweet a lot what they're looking for in terms of news sources. And so, you may have a journalist who tweets, today, hey, I'm looking to interview a teacher. Well, if I know a teacher or I have a client who's a teacher, then maybe I could reach out and respond to them and say, hey, I have a teacher that would be perfect, and here's why. So again, using those, like you said, Anne Marie, is using those social media listening tools. And sometimes it's just a basic search of the toolbar and seeing what people are saying. You don't need to use any external tools. Google and Twitter search and Facebook search, they're all free. Use it to your advantage and see what it is that, these journalists are looking for. And then another tip is there is a free resource, because I am a huge fan of free, called HARO, which is called Help a Reporter Out. And so I utilize HARO a lot, again, to be able to see what the journalists are looking for, because we don't live in a time where we have time to second guess if this is relevant to them or not. And so those free resources, we're able to see exactly what it is they're looking for, and then we're able to pitch to them accordingly.
Good. No, that's excellent advice. And we use HARO all the time. So it's a great tool. Sharon, what about you?
I really want to build off of what Stephanie said, and really what all of you have said. Use HARO, but even more so, pay attention. You cannot be a storyteller of your company or brand unless you are following what is the conversation in the news and on social media and what your neighbors and community are talking about. And if that means pausing or pushing the launch or sending out a press release or whatever to make it known that you are paying attention, you have to think about that. I'll give an example. Anne Marie, you'll remember this. A couple of years ago, we were doing some work for the global brand called Velcro. Everybody knows the stuff that sticks on, it's called hook and loop fastener is what it actually is. Anyhow, we were ready to go with the launch. And was it a hurricane?
Yes, it was a very devastating hurricane in the Caribbean.
It was a hurricane that obviously we did not want to try and launch this campaign that included some humorous musicals and humorous parts of it, and be tone deaf to the hundreds of people who were losing their homes just a couple hundred miles off of the US coast. So you want to be very mindful about what is happening before you put it out there. And there are some other quick little tips that we do and right now it's really noisy in the COVID world, unemployment, election. However, there's ways that you can use what's happening in the news cycle almost like a hook. So for example, we have a client called LCI, and they are the largest employer of Americans who are blind and low vision. And some of the products they make are office supplies, which could be school supplies. What? Oh, well, they have never thought about doing a back to school campaign, and they have an online website. They have e-commerce. So last week I said to them, hold on a second. You sell pencils, pens, books, paper, filing things, shredders, all. They're like, yeah. but they mostly sell to government agencies. However, their website is completely available for anyone to buy from. I said, hold the phone. Can we not do a back to school campaign? And so it's being creative with, you're not coming up with new assets per se or in reinventing what this company does. They're already doing it. We're just coming up with a new creative way to tell the story. So those are some tips that you can look and see what's already in front of you and be creative, do some brainstorming, bring people into the room for brainstorming that maybe don't normally come to it, because you never know where the next great idea is coming from.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. And it brings in what all of you have talked about, that diversity of thought, right? Making sure you have different people in the room helping to make some of these decisions. I think creativity is the other point that is so important, because there is a lot of negative happening this year, but there are some businesses who are fortunate enough that if we're creative, we can actually help people as well as grow our business because of those opportunities like you just mentioned. And so rather than think about what you've always done in the past and how you've always done things in the past, what are some ways you can adjust based on this new normal that we're in? So that, I appreciate that. It was a lot of great tips. One of the things I want to mention, there was one chat that came through, but I think both from Jackie and Sharon, I think what we can do is in the recap email that people get, if we can put those specific tips that you guys shared, because those were super valuable, and we can just list those out in that email to make sure people have those.
I actually have a blog post that I wrote at the beginning of the pandemic, and it was called A Crisis Communications Primer for Uncertain Times.
Okay.
So we can certainly put that link into the chat for that blog post, and it's super helpful. It has the 4 steps: the no comment, the buy time statement, and all of that.
That would be great. That would be great. I think that I want to start to move into just a couple of questions for you guys as we wind down a little bit, related to effective communication. Again, going back to kind of your expertise area. And Sharon, I want to stay with you for a moment. But how do you measure communication? So how do you know if you are being effective and something is working, regardless if it's internal to your employees or external to your customers? What are some ways that you can actually measure that?
Well, there's a couple of different things you can be doing. So externally, what you want to do is put a Google alert on the name of your company and maybe the name of the people who you put out there as spokespeople for your company. So if it's a CEO or if it's, a sales manager, whomever it is that sort of is a spokesperson for your company, you want to put a Google alert, which is free, on those people, the company and those people who are going to be speaking on behalf of it. And that way you can constantly be listening. You will get an email alert saying, so-and-so was in the news. That way you don't miss something. You also can measure your media results and PR results. There are a number of paid ways to do that, but I like to be bootstrappy and scrappy. And so I do a lot of Googling. Anytime I am going to be doing a new call or meeting with somebody to talk about their public relations efforts, I put in the name of the company in Google, and then I click the news button. I mean, it's such a simple, free thing. See what others are talking about and see what's happening in not only that company, but then also the industry. You really need to do your research on whom it is that you're going to be working with. And that will help you on the measurement phase. And then, you've got to find your own system of documenting your coverage. And like I said, there are paid ways to do that, but there's free ways that you can use Evernote, you can use Google Drive, you can do all these various things to make sure you're assembling and keeping any and all coverage of your specific company. But then also you want to look at industry trends to be keeping up with what the latest is.
Perfect. Thank you for that. I want to go to Anne-Marie next, and you mentioned something early on, which is kind of gets lost around people, what really social media is, right? And so what's some advice or tips that you can give to people about really engaging, so we're not just posting and just sharing, but really actually engaging with the audience?
Yeah, one easy way, I think brands fall into a trap of always talking about themselves and posting about themselves and their news and pushing their latest. And a very easy way to start to pivot into more of a conversational and storytelling format is actually talking about yourself through your advocates. So telling your advocates stories, telling how much maybe it's a product or service, maybe not a testimonial per se, but almost like the faces of our customers. That's an easy way to start to pull people in. Another thing that you can do is just try to make things more interactive. Really, ask questions. You don't always have to, I think, it doesn't have to be like earth shattering. You can always put stuff out and see how it works. Keep a tally of different types of content that you're putting out and maybe have someone caption a funny photo or something you have from your business. I mean, there's different creative ways. What you should do is take a look at other businesses either that you admire or businesses that are similar to yours. And it's not to copy what they're doing, but they might inspire you. I come from a background of improv comedy, and so I believe a lot in yes and having a great idea and then building upon it. So you might see even like a clothing brand that's doing something, and maybe you're in automotive or manufacturing, and you're like, that's actually a really interesting idea. I bet you I could pivot that concept to what I'm doing too. I think that you can find a lot of inspiration from what people are putting out there. And then Amy, this wasn't really what you had asked, but one thing I did want to mention is I think it's a hard time for brands right now a little bit because there is so much noise. And sometimes, with injustices, it's, do I get involved and do I not? And I would never do that. I would never tell a client to do that flippantly. What I would say is that you want to make sure that as a brand, you always have a point of view. You have a point of view and you're always willing to pivot if necessary. So the one thing also about being human online and having people feel like they're connecting with another person when you are a brand is that you are willing to learn and you're willing to change your opinion if you need to. So I think some brands even are, maybe they're posting less and they don't want to get engaged. They're not sure how to, to get involved. And I would listen to your gut and do what's right, have a point of view in your brand and be willing to pivot and change if you have to.
And I think also getting your employees involved, because I think from an external standpoint, the customers may feel one way or the other if they don't hear from you as their brand, but I think the employees do as well if their company isn't, like you said, taking a stand one way or the other. Hopefully it's in line with your employees, but at least you're standing for something or you're on one particular side. And I think the employees appreciate that as well. Good. I appreciate that. Stephanie, I want to go to you. One question that we have here is around back to effective communication in general. Do you have any advice if an employee, how do you know if your employees don't think you're doing a good job? If you're running a company, but an employee may not speak it. If they're not happy with how you're communicating, they might not say anything. How can you get that feel or how can you get that sense of what your employees are thinking?
I think it could be challenging to get honest feedback, but I think your job as the employer is to constantly open the door for feedback. As long as you're opening up the door and you're presenting opportunities for people to be able to say like, hey, this isn't working, and not feel as if they do tell you that you're going to retaliate against them. I think that's the most important thing. Because at the end of the day, none of us are mind readers. So we don't know what's working until you tell us it's not working. So just be willing to have that open and transparent conversation. And I don't think that's something that can happen overnight. That happens from building relationships with people. And I think now more than ever, we have to make sure that we're building relationships with one another, especially internally with those who work with us. And as you build those relationships, I do believe that people will be more open to having transparent conversations with you about what's working and what's not.
Yeah. And then Jackie, kind of along those same lines with inclusive language, again, because people may not express that they're offended, and you've provided some great tips on things that we as individuals can do to make sure our language is inclusive. But are there other tips you can share to identify if you have said something wrong or inappropriate to someone if they don't come out and directly tell you that it's inappropriate?
Yeah, Amy, that's a hard one because you don't have that, face-to-face situation where you can read full body language.
Yeah.
What I would recommend is if you're using Zoom, we have the default is usually the strip across the top that usually contains the pictures of the people who are talking the most, right? And then the people who aren't saying much fall to the end and you don't see them. What I would recommend is changing that view so that you can see everyone on the screen as much as possible and really continue to scan through, because it'll show sometimes in their face if you've said something that offends them. And then to Stephanie's point, relationship building is so important, and a relationship of trust. Because if you have that, you know, you can expect that sometimes they might come to you, or you can go to them at least and say, hey, I noticed you got quiet on the call. Watch for that disengagement, because that's a major indicator that someone is offended. And go back to them and say, I noticed you got quiet on the call. Is there something that I said or something that happened in the call that you didn't agree with, that upset you, offended you? And, you know, hopefully if you have that relationship of trust, they'll share that. But it's very difficult, Amy, when you're not seeing people face to face. But I would say just get in the habit of making sure that you're scanning for faces and watching for disengagement. Those are the two things that I would say you can do to make sure that you're managing that.
Good. No, I appreciate that, because I think even if as things go maybe a little bit back to what we're used to, it's not going to be fully what we're used to. So even some offices, people are kind of staggering times. So you're still not there with everyone, you know, so some part of your population would be remote. And yeah, with that lack of seeing people's body language, it does make it so difficult. So I think it's important that each of us, back to what Stephanie said, we're not mind readers. So you can't expect that your boss or your peer knows that something upset you. But at the same time, if you're the employer and you're the boss, you do have to make some effort to try to get that information from people. So it is a balance and a bit of a challenge there. So I appreciate that feedback. We're going to actually wind it down. There are some folks I want to take a moment to thank. And certainly if any of you have any last thoughts you wanted to share, you can jump in a moment. But I wanted to take just a minute. We had a couple of sponsors that helped us just get this together and promote this event. And so I just wanted to give them a little shout out. But we had 5 Points Business District, the Diversity Movement, Black Dollar, and Walk West. And they helped us a lot, just getting the word out, like I mentioned. I also certainly want to thank each of you guys that, each of you that joined me today. And we're a panelist. I didn't do that intentionally, but that we're a panelist on this session. And I think, you know, communication is obviously so important. We're a little bit limited kind of because of some of the things that are happening in the world, but that's not an excuse. We still have to make the effort. We still have to teach ourselves the right way to communicate with each other, with our customers, with our employees, you know, with our teams. And then if you have something that you're communicating to the press, or unfortunately something negative, making sure that you're doing that the right way. So I appreciate each of you taking the time today to just share your expertise and share your insights. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we'll be sending out an email to everyone that registered. And we'll put some of those, I know some of the links are in the chat for Sharon's blog, but some of those tips, particularly the ones that Jackie shared and that Sharon shared, we'll put those into that email, because I think everything was valuable, but those were certainly some concrete steps that people could implement. So again, thank you all for joining us today. And thank you to our panelists again. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day, as well as a great weekend. So take care.
Thanks, Amy.
Thank you.
Bye.